Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled The Strategic and Scientific Imperative for Prospectively Generated Real World Evidence. My name is Sydney, and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Worldwide Clinical Trials who developed the content for this presentation. Worldwide Clinical Trials is a global, mid-sized contract research organization that provides top-performing bioanalytical phase 1 through 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. Founded in 1986 by physicians committed to advancing medical science, its full-service clinical experience ranges from early phase and bioanalytical sciences through late-phase studies, post-approval, and real-world evidence. Major therapeutic areas of focus include cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroscience, oncology, and rare diseases. Operating in over 60 countries with offices in North and South America, Eastern and Western Europe, and Asia, Worldwide is powered by its more than 3,000 employee experts. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our moderator, Jeff Trotter, who will introduce our speakers. And Jeff, you may begin when ready.
Thanks, Sydney. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone listening in. Our panelists are generally in the US, although Florence is joining us from the UK. So again, delighted to be talking about this important subject. Without further ado, let me move on to our formal introductions. So just for those that don't know me, I've been involved in the field of health economics, outcomes research, real world evidence for about 150 years. Actually, it's probably closer to 40, but it feels like 150. And I'm Senior Vice President of our Real World Evidence Group within Worldwide. I've been involved with the industry for a number of years, again, with largely primarily on the service side with CROs and niche consulting organizations. I'm delighted to be joined by three thought leaders in the field. One is Mary Glenn Vreeland, one of my colleagues from at least 20 of my 150 years. Mary Glenn really heads up our operational group running observational studies and registries and is a senior director for the Worldwide Evidence Business Unit. Florence Barkat is a consultant on digital transformation and the chief commercial officer of Cisiv, a global health technology company. Really one of the first to develop a fit-for-purpose platform for real-world studies, and delighted to have Florence joining us. I've known her for a number of years from the UK. Finally, Dilesh Dashi is Vice President of Global Health Economics and Outcomes Research for Acadia Pharmaceuticals. I've known Dilesh for a number of years. He has over 20 years experience in the field with both large and small pharmaceutical companies in health economics, real-world evidence, population health, and health policy. So welcome to my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to an engaging, provocative discussion. And again, as Sydney mentioned, we'll be delighted to entertain questions at the end. Extra points for being controversial and provocative and for really stumping our panel here. So without further ado, let me go to the next slide and just kind of set the stage. Again, the topic is really focused on prospectively generated real-world evidence, but we will focus on the landscape of real-world evidence and real-world data, which has probably already changed in the just few minutes we've been talking today. But first, let me give some key definitions. Again, when we think about real-world, this is actually a quote I've been using for a number of years. It's something that I think the general public doesn't recognize, that the conditions under which drugs are approved for regulatory purposes are rarely those conditions under which the drugs are actually utilized. So the real world is maybe a little bit messy, but it's also real important in contrast to the more pristine experimental conditions where we're using perfect patients, perfectly controlled designs for randomized clinical trials, which are vital, but they're different than the real world. Again, clinical trial populations tend to be more perfect. We really want to find out if the drug or device actually works in those conditions. But then again, the products are actually used under far different conditions. And it's increasingly important to figure out what happens in this real world setting. So we need evidence. Evidence generally, very generically talks about the data needed to support a particular assertion, whether that be real world safety, effectiveness, efficacy, or value. And I'll talk a second about value. In contrast, so we've got real world evidence, RWE, and then real world data. Now, data by itself really doesn't do much. It's used for a variety of different purposes. And I have put together kind of a very simple formula. D plus I equals E. Data plus intent equals evidence. Again, we want to use the data for something. And if indeed we're trying to persuade somebody about a particular issue, then we need evidence. And again, real world data increasingly refers to the data that are increasingly available in the real world from medical records, electronic medical records, wearables, claims, data, with an important caveat that these data are typically available, increasingly available, but they're also intended for different purposes. So a medical record is obviously an important document in managing a particular patient, documenting treatment regimens and outcomes, but it may not have been devised for outcomes research or real world evidence analyses. The column on the right really, again, talks about the evolution that we've experienced really quite rapidly, really over the last just few years, since maybe 2016. And that was kind of the time when the 21st Century Cures Act was developed and promulgated here in the US, noting the limitations of data from randomized clinical trials. Are great data for proving drug efficacy, but may not be as useful for day-to-day medical decision making. Prior to that, the work that many of us have done in the field of health economics and outcomes research was really focused on documenting value, clinical value, economic value, humanistic or patient-centric value, and perhaps largely to stakeholders like payers and insurers, so for market access and reimbursement purposes. What's happened, again, over the last several years is that now the FDA in the US and many other regulatory bodies are embracing data, accepting data, certainly promulgating guidances on what constitutes reliable data. But now we're seeing real world data, real world evidence used across the clinical and commercial spectrum. And that brings up a whole bunch of issues that I think we'll talk about today. So next slide, please. What I'll do now is kind of introduce our general flow. We'll talk a little bit about that evolving landscape that I just teed up. We'll then go into the concept of a real-world evidence portfolio. We'll talk about data. We'll talk about prospective studies. We'll talk about maybe the pros and cons of each, recognizing that there's no one solution that's going to meet everybody's needs every day. And then we'll finish up by maybe spending the bulk of the time talking about prospective studies, prospective real-world initiatives, the how and why, the when, some of the operational nuances that make these designed and operationalized quite differently from randomized clinical studies. So let's go into the evolving landscape, and we'll spend a few minutes teeing up some discussion with the panel, and then we'll have a poll question to finish off this section. So yeah, I think basically the next slide, well, I think we don't need this slide. Anyway, but let me start it out by kind of talking about this landscape, and I'll start with Dilesh. I'll pick on you in terms of what you've seen in general over the last 20, maybe the last 3 years, in terms of how this landscape has evolved, in terms of maybe both long and short-term perspective. So you're on. What do you think?
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and excited to be here. So as I guess Jeff you mentioned you're 150 years in the industry, so I'll go back about halfway there. In some cases, real-world evidence, you can argue that the Framingham heart study was real-world evidence, right? And that started 60, 70 years ago. Some of us pharmacists who spend time in hospitals, we used to do drug utilization reviews, drug utilization evaluations, looking at how drugs were being used in a hospital setting, in the real-world setting. So it's been around for a while, as you know. But the challenge has always been it was never considered a real science, right, by specifically regulatory authorities, and the lack of reproducibility, right? If you did one study and I did the same study, I'm not sure we would come up with the same results. So evolution in terms of where the focus has been and where we've come from. Just in my time in industry, Jeff, we used to just work with pharmacy claims data, and then eventually we got integration with medical claims data, and now we can get the electronic health records. But I think probably the two main important evolutionary sort of data points or time points were the FDA coming up with different guidances around real-world evidence, and that is very significant because it now opens the door for us to use this data for regulatory submission, and even if it's not for regulatory submission, it gives us some guidance around standardization of this type of data. And I think just the realization that randomized clinical trials have some inherent limitations to it. They're shorter in nature, in time point, populations are very specific. And as we focus more on rare disease or oncology, where you can't study this population in the large numbers that you can perhaps in a cardiovascular disease or diabetes, the focus on real-world evidence, at least from my perspective in industry, has just grown, and from phase 1 onwards to launch and post-launch. So,
do you think there was any one event that caused this rapid endorsement recognition, at the FDA, for example, or was it just kind of, again, I remember that years ago they used to kind of give lip service to the idea of observational research, but it seems to have changed. Any one thing that's caused this revolution?
I can't pinpoint one thing. I'll just focus on, I think when you look at the lack of diversity in clinical trials, right, where the FDA has acknowledged the clinical trials don't have the diverse population, either from a race, ethnicity, or even a subpopulation. And as we do more research and more approvals in disease areas where, like I said, rare or ultra rare, we just can't do ethically certain clinical trials in the way we want to. So that's just my 2 cents. I'll open it to the panel. I'm sure there's more than that, but I think that has been the most significant advancement, Jeff, in terms of our perspective around real-world evidence.
Yeah, I know, Florence, I'll tee you up. I know, technology has evolved a little bit over the last, decade or so. I used to joke that I think this internet thing is here to stay. My kids roll their eyes when I say that pretty much regularly, as my colleagues do. But maybe from a technological perspective, what have you seen as far as how things have evolved, client expectations, use cases? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for having me here as well. So if I can bring the perspective of the technology, I think if we go back 20 years or 15 years, well, maybe 15 years ago, traditionally, the biggest change has been the digitization of data, of patient data. And we went from paper records in hospitals to electronic health records. And equally, we've seen a change from case report forms on paper to electronic case report forms. So the biggest shift in the last 15 years has been the electronic data capture system. And for the last 15 years, we were still very much, there's been a very slow change and recognition to realize that a real world study or a prospective observational study is not a clinical trial, and therefore the approach and the technology should be different. In terms of client expectation, the pandemic has made a big change, because all of a sudden the realization that we can consume a lot more data and different sources of data digitally. So PROs can be digitalized, consent can be digitalized, and the biggest request is to have less burden to the site and to patients. So that is what technology needs to enable, and that's what they're looking for in terms of expectation. And then I could say, two last trends that sort of have been pulling things apart. One is, on one hand, there are definitely better standards from a technology, clinical informatics. There's slowly a convergence, not just in the US, but in other parts of Europe and other markets, other areas. And on the other hand, we have greater requirements for data privacy, and rightly so. So these are all things to consider in prospective observational studies and any real-world study. So I hope this answers the question.
I think, again, there's so many issues that are impacted by so many other issues, and I think you came up with a very interesting one as far as how these studies are designed, if sites are involved, if these are direct-to-patient initiatives. Reducing the burden is obviously an important operational component, but it also allows the real world to really happen. If we're spending too much time entering data and doing things that are unnatural, well, we've kind of ruined the observational experience. So let me turn it over to you, Mary Glenn. And I should mention, maybe it's obvious, that Dilesh kind of is representing the pharma biotech side, Florence is representing the tech side, and Mary Glenn is stuck in the middle, representing the research side, the contract research organization. So, Mary Glenn, what have you seen as far as some of the evolving differences, and maybe how clients are asking for different things, perhaps over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, Jeff, from a variety of perspectives. Interestingly, we're just a few minutes into today's webinar, and you've said the word change. We've already started to talk about change, right? That's a constant in our industry, and it's certainly, as we reflect upon the last few years, change has been occurring at a very fast pace within our industry. I also want to preface this by saying, I've had the pleasure and honor of working, Jeff, with you and learning from you over the past 25 plus years. And as I've reflected upon that, so much has changed during this time for us, both personally. We talked a little bit earlier, like before this call started, like we're empty nesters. We share photos of our dogs. I've adopted another English bulldog. You're playing music and baseball. Like there's been a lot of change personally. And then also professionally, you and I have both been in this field of late stage research for, I think you said 100 years, and I've been maybe 25 years, right? So a long time together, and much has really changed professionally throughout our careers as we think about the field of late stage research. And so one of the things I thought would be helpful is to just kind of quickly take a walk down memory lane, Jeff, and maybe reminisce a little bit about what changed, and then quickly address some of your questions around what are some of those client questions, where are the requests evolving over time. But as I recall some of our initial meetings, you and I would, one of the changes is we'd actually walk into rooms and meet with clients face to face, right? And so today we are working very remotely. Pros and cons of challenges with that, but there's a great amount of technology for us to be, very comfortable now through video technologies and teleconferences. But Jeff, as I was thinking about some of our prior, meetings years ago, when we would meet with clients, we'd walk into the room, we'd talk a little bit about, we'd see who was involved. It was typical medical affairs, focusing on safety, marketing, focusing on several means to communicate their key messages. And, and as Dilesh has also alluded, like there's been a handful of clients that have had an HER member or two. And I know that there's been a lot of expansion in other departments and roles within pharma companies really focus in building their practices. And, typically in the past, these meetings would occur just prior to a product launch. We talk about maybe a approvals, safety surveillance study. In terms of the study design, there was really a focus on topics that were important then and actually remain important today. So focusing on patient safety, quality of life, assessments and clinical outcomes, and the treatment's cost effectiveness. But as we've said earlier, real world evidence and real world data have really evolved on many levels, and there's certainly more interest. We all are familiar with the fact that the FDA has some, and other major regulatory agencies across the globe have recently formulated draft guidelines related to registry data, EHR, claims data, data standards for real world evidence. And I was thinking about this last night, and just for fun, I guess you could say, as I was thinking about, what RW, means real world data, real world evidence. And I just decided to do a random Google search. So take it for what it's worth. But when I Googled the term real world evidence, the search results yielded approximately 1.6 billion results. Okay, so I know that there's some differences in how you can interpret that, but I thought that was a pretty big number. And so then I decided, let's Google real world data, and that resulted in over 5 billion results. So I think that speaks a lot to how this field has evolved, how many more people are engaged and interested, really in a variety of areas, right? So there's been, I think, an explosion, for lack of a better term, especially over the last few years in these two areas. And then just because I was like, those numbers seem really high, but just for fun, I just thought, well, I'm going to Google Harry Styles and see how that compares, right? So when I Googled his name, he yielded only a mere 327 million results. So what does that say? I mean, real world data, real world evidence. Yeah, it's
so it's
out
more
there.
important than Harry Styles is what you're saying.
It could be, right? So I thought that
think
those numbers, I know that they can be interpreted in different ways, but I just thought that also spoke to the evolution and the focus and how many organizations are becoming involved today in these areas. It's not just the typical historical CRO model. And I know we'll talk more about this today in terms of how we partner with other organizations for technology and insights and partnering with our clients. But, Jeff, to go back to the specific questions around our client needs and how they're evolving over time, I really have seen a broadened and increased depth in the experience and the number of client team members that are involved in contributing to the design of these studies. And so we're bringing in chief medical officers, patient advocacy members, pharmacovigilance, scientific advisory boards, technology partners, and I know Florence will talk more about this later, and others, to really bring in a more diverse group to help and contribute to the design of these studies. The other thing that's really changed is that clients are engaging us earlier as they're thinking about evidence planning holistically. One of the terms I've been reading about recently is, it's an involved level of bringing everybody into these discussions. It's called integrated evidence planning. So starting that early on, using real world data to incorporate real world evidence into earlier phases of research and drug development, and really think about it holistically in terms of spanning a product's life cycle. And so as we think about this, real world study results are increasingly being included in regulatory submissions to provide additional therapeutic context, maybe about the natural history of the disease, and to support label recognition, revisions and expansion. And then, one thing that I know is at the forefront of all of our minds, as I think about those of us on the call today, a major focus is, and Dilesh alluded to this earlier as well, eliminating or minimizing barriers to research. So designing those studies that are scientifically sound and patient and site-centric. And part of that is ensuring participation of diverse populations that are able to participate in trials. How are we reaching them? How are we involving them? You know, because really that is a population that really will be able to better reflect the real world demographics of interest and those who are affected. So, you know, and easing the study participation of sites and patients. And then I think, you know, lastly, expanding from the purely observational study design to incorporate some of the things that are out there we've briefly touched on thus far, but incorporating, you know, low interventional, observational is a term that we've used, components to the study, including historic controls into our study design, having a low interventional component versus purely observational, incorporating historical controls, an ability to add new cohorts and allowing for sub-studies, and then taking into consideration the competitive landscape. And, you know, I know Florence talked about this a little bit, but I'm confident that she can speak more about the technology related to this and really how we have a unique ability at this point to employ a variety of analytical tools, technology, wearable devices to more efficiently and quickly identify, activate sites, enroll patients, and streamline data and supportive data integrity.
Let me cut you off because you've unpacked it, and now there's all sorts of stuff on the floor here that we're going to have to address.
Yeah,
I think you know,
there's a lot. Yeah,
talking about your Google searches, that Google's now involved in research in many ways. So it is a different landscape, and we're seeing a lot of continued evolution, very rapid evolution. Let me move on to a poll question to get our audience involved a little bit in talking about experience with real-world evidence and real-world data. I'll turn it over to you, Sydney.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jeff. So our first poll question that we have for our audience today is, what's your organization's experience with real-world evidence and real-world data? So please select one of the following answers. First of all, we're trying to figure out if it makes sense for us. Second one, we're committed to doing something and have dipped our toes into the water. Third, we're involved in a few different projects and are assessing the benefits. And fourth, we have one or more employees dedicated to implementing our real-world evidence or real-world data plans. So I'll give our audience another couple of seconds to get in their votes. That question again is, what's your organization's experience with real-world evidence or real-world data? Thank you very much to our audience for voting. I'm going to now close the poll and share those results with you in one moment. All right, so we have 15% for we're trying to figure out if it makes sense for us. 15% for we're committed to doing something and have dipped our toes into the water, 23% for we're involved in a few different projects and are assessing the benefits, and 46% for we have one or more employees dedicated to implementing our real-world evidence, real-world data plans. Back to you.
That's interesting, and maybe a little bit surprising to me. I think the 1 through 4 reflects, you know, question 1 is kind of we're just trying to figure it out. Question 4 is, you know, we've got a couple of employees, at least a couple, dedicated to organization-wide to implementing a real-world evidence, real-world data plans. And I guess I was anticipating it would be a little less, but yeah, I think that's really good progress. Guys, any thoughts about that?
I think, Jeff, that aligns with what I'm seeing in industry. I think there is the staffing component, but then there is the capability and the skill set, right? And to be able to do that and how we reach out to groups like yourselves and others. But probably doesn't surprise me as Mary Glenn, you did a Google search on the terminology. If I do a Google search on the job openings, there's a lot of job openings for real world evidence, and that's just reflective of, and it's not in just single industry, it's across the span of healthcare. And Jeff, you made a point that I want to come back to it later or right now, which is companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft and Amazon are jumping in with both feet and hands into this pond, if you will, and they have the capability, the resource, the data to really exponentially bring this field much farther than we have. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with this real world evidence and real world data.
Yeah, I think the consumerism of real, again, this is the real world, and there are consumers out there. I think about Walgreens and CVS, drugstores getting involved, and then Amazon and Google from a technology standpoint. There are players in this area that weren't there, this morning. So it's a continually evolving field. It's nice to see. Again, this may not be a perfectly epidemiologically sound sampling of our audience, but that's good progress. I think it's nice that there are still a few newbies in the field, but it's nice to see that there's advancements in terms of companies recognizing that we've got to devote employees to this area, and it does cross the full continuum. Let's move on to the next section. I won't spend any time on this slide. Really, just this is an example of Mary Glenn mentioned integrated evidence planning. We put a couple of these plans together for clients where, again, no one strategy, whether it's a database strategy or a prospective strategy, is going to rule the day. There's a recognition that, again, different tools at different times, but the portfolio approach is something that we're seeing more and more of. So let's get into some of the issues related to that. And I guess I'm going to tee this up with our panel in saying, all right, let's focus on the development time frame in phase 1, 2, and 3, not necessarily phase 4. Let's talk about, because I'm thinking this is a relatively new phenomena, how real world data is being used perhaps more by a development organization. And let's talk about some of the pros and cons of data. One of the issues that I've seen is emulating the standard of care. Finding out data that really reflects what's happening out there is great, but it may not give us everything. It may not give us patient perspective. It may not give us assessments that are really vital for demonstrating the effectiveness of a particular product, even in the real world. So let's think about how RWE, RWD fits in, and focusing a little bit more on the development stages. Dilesh, maybe you can share your perspective on how you've seen data being leveraged. What are some of the pros and cons, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think I would add another column here as well on the left, Jeff, which is for a number of small companies, biotech companies that have resource constraint, real-world data I've seen is being leveraged even in the decision to move forward with a clinical program, right? Because sort of the business development types of decisions, or say, okay, should we even submit the II? So I think that's something to keep in mind and come back to. Phase 1 is ideal, but I see a lot of use of real-world evidence starting in phase 2, phase 3, of course, post-launch. You had on the slide, Jeff, the existing data set, which are nice. We actually, as Florence mentioned, they're quite more robust now than they were just a couple of decades ago, and they are cost and time efficient for us to get a glimpse into the natural history and the treatment patterns and the patient journey, whatever you want to call that. But it gives us the quantity of the data, but it doesn't give us the quality of the data, right? And especially from the patient and caregiver perspective, it gives us those existing data sets give us the perspective from reimbursement or healthcare provider perspective. It doesn't give us enough from a caregiver or patient perspective. So inevitably, we have a discussion about prospectively generated real-world evidence and when and how and who should we work with and what we need to do around that. So I think, just in terms of the development life cycle, it's critical to start thinking around at least phase 2, if you're lucky enough to have this conversation in phase 1, to see what endpoints we should include based on what we've learned from real-world data. And they could be exploratory or secondary endpoint that can help us bridge that clinical trial to real-world data later. And then, or just understanding what the gaps will be in our clinical development program, so we can start to plan to how to fill those gaps in with the real world evidence. So a lot of what Mary Glenn said earlier is to have those very early discussions. We know from the FDA that this is our clinical development program. It's baked, it's in a box, it's sent to the FDA. We don't have a lot of room to negotiate there. Okay, well, we need something else to either drive the healthcare provider to, prescribe that medication, or the payer to pay for it, or the patient to seek out and ask for it. And that data needs to be complemented with the RCT. And we can't have siloed execution of this, right? Planning and execution. And we see that a lot too, because, oh, that's your job, so you do that. I'm just focused on the FDA piece. Inevitably, then we get two separate sets of information, and then we'll have to reconcile at some point.
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing a lot of, and Mary Glenn alluded to it, a lot more collaboration, greater appreciation for what used to be someone else's responsibility. And Florence, just really quickly, we're talking about evolution. I don't know what's coming down the pike, but we're seeing a lot of data as perhaps the source for machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence. Is that something that we need to embrace today, or wait till it settles a little bit further? What do you think?
Yeah, Jeff, I'll one thing just to bounce back from what Dilesh said, and I'll answer the machine learning question. The biggest change I'm seeing, and this is from my time working at the sponsor side, is real world evidence used to sit in different teams, market access here, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit in clinical development. And now what we're seeing is that there's one team, the real world evidence team, in charge of function to help all the other teams, because it's needed everywhere. And that's a really big shift in the industry. Sorry, that was an important point. But to answer your question about AI and machine learning, I think, first of all, it's still a big mystery. We hear all these words. So just to define it, it's basically AI is a constellation of terminology that includes natural language processing, artificial intelligence, and they're basically computer algorithm that helps to build mathematical models based on a set of training data in order to make predictions generally. So I would say they're very powerful. It's definitely something to embrace if you have data sets. And if you know how to answer, how to ask the right question. Now, as you know, the challenge is that sometimes the data is not there. There are gaps. And so no amount of AI or machine learning can answer the question if the data is just not there. So what I have seen, and what increasingly we are doing, is actually looking at how we can both use AI or machine learning along with prospective observational research data that we've gone and collected. And when you combine the two and you look at the two, it's actually incredibly powerful. It also opens up new opportunities around population health management, which is the next thing that, once a product is on the market, you want to say, who is this best for? You want to engage with the health system and payers, and it's incredibly powerful. So yeah. I'll stop there. I could go on for a long time.
It's again, a fascinating evolution. And I think, Dilesh, you articulated different use cases. Sometimes data is a means to an end. Sometimes it's an end in and of itself. But again, there are gaps. It's not a perfect world. Some of these databases were developed for different reasons. So we're not always going to hit the proverbial home run in American parlance here. Mary Glenn, really quickly, we're going to go to a poll question, but maybe this is a tough one, and I don't go haywire on this one. But is data? Are we seeing real world data as a substitute for a randomized clinical trial? I'll just throw that one out there.
Yeah, great question. I think, historically and certainly recently, we've seen and we've experienced a need for more efficient, innovative ways to ultimately test the safety and effectiveness of drugs, right? So including scenarios where there's differences in outcomes that can be quickly detected. And so along with that, we've also seen historically that, RCTs have several inefficiencies. They don't reflect standard of care. They can be significantly costly, require substantial resources and time. And while real world data and real world evidence aren't specifically substitute for clinical trials, that they are a way to augment trials and can be effective in terms of using that information to submit to the current approval process. And I recently read a quote from, I think it was the former FDA commissioner, and his perspective was that something along the lines of having an ideal approach would be a hybrid system using clinical trials and real world evidence. And so, as I think about these different scenarios, and I know, Jeff, we had talked a little bit about like the biotech industry and how we're leveraging some of that information through EHR and populating the data. So I think that there are a number of factors that we should be considering as it relates to that. So as we think about biotech, the data, the quality, the speed, the integration, precision, risk identification, and some of those key components, I think that those kinds of scenarios, when we're talking about maybe a phase 2 study and how can we leverage or introduce some real world data components, there's some real opportunities to do there. And so using real world data to inform some of the aspects of the trial design, thinking about the target audience and the product profile for things like looking at new molecules, leveraging the real world data to understand how different inclusion criteria could impact the clinical outcomes. I mean, those are a couple things that, we've certainly been talking about and exploring. And then again, going back to how can we use these data to meet the unmet needs of a patient population to be assessed. And I think as we think about some industries, like specifically to biotech, defining which patient subpopulations are likely to benefit under drugs, under investigation, incorporating the use of biomarkers.
Oops, we lost you, Mary Glenn. Well, I'll continue on wrapping up this section. Yeah, I think, Dilesh, you mentioned a couple interesting use cases, particularly when, in rare disease audience or populations where we might be able to simulate the control arm. So, yeah, I don't know that we're seeing data substitute for RCTs, but certainly being part of the mix. So let's go to our next poll question. Cindy, yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. Our next poll question is, what's your organization's experience with RWD data sets? Please select one of the following. We have none to very little experience. We're using them to support clinical development. We're using them to support HEOR and or market access purposes, or we're routinely using RWD across the organization. That question again is, what's your organization's experience with RWD data sets? I'll give our audience another few seconds to get in their votes. Thank you very much to our audience for participating in these polls. I'm going to close the poll and share those results. So we have 14% for we have none to very little experience, 36% for we're using them to support clinical development, 14% for we're using them to support HEOR and or market access purposes, and 36% for we're routinely using RWD across the organization.
Interesting.
Okay, now I can hear you. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
so,
we've moved on to our poll question. Sorry about that. I was just talking about, really how we can use some of these different scenarios to offer patient populations in a different way to really leverage what we're able to get from these data. So having things like fit for purpose studies, employing a variety of data collection methods and strategies, and then linking some of those real world data sources to clinical information are things that we're certainly pursuing and having more discussions about.
Okay, well, Mary Glenn, technology got the worst of you, and you froze and we moved on. So
okay.
So yeah, no surprises, I don't think, for that poll question. Again, we're seeing a lot of evolution. Organizations thinking about it in development, organizations using it for maybe more quote unquote traditional uses. Let's move on to the final section of our talk, where we're going to really address really the title of the presentation, the imperative of prospective research. I think we're in agreement that there are limitations to some of the data out there, but they also serve an important purpose. So yeah, let's think about prospective studies. And I guess, again, I'll throw out a few questions. Maybe Florence, I'll start with you. I know one of our common concerns is that people look at prospective observational research as quote unquote clinical trial light. What do you think about that?
Oh, that pushes my buttons. I have seen some of the most complex studies in oncology, much more complex than clinical trials, and they are very, very complex to operationalize and to deliver to deliver well. So I'll just answer that. I'd like to focus on the technology structures that accommodate the variability and imperfection of real-world treatment and patients. And I mean, the reality is that in the real world, the intended use of a drug might say prescribe 1 a day at 80 microgram a day, but sometimes physician prescribe something else, and the patient might go home and wash it down with a glass of whiskey. And these are all, and the patient is supposed to come back every 2 months, but they don't. They might come back every 3 months or not at all. So there's a lot of imperfection and variability. So a couple of things. In terms of the data collection, what we focus on is ensuring high quality of data at the point of entry. And again, there's a variety of method and technology available to do that. And that's because the nature of the data is different. And the nature of the data that is in these studies is different. It's often over a long period of time and very infrequent. The other thing is that often these studies are multi-country. There's a kind of an umbrella with a core data set, and they have multiple protocol variations. So you need to have a technology that's flexible to be able to accommodate this. And you want one database. Equally, often you can see a lot of protocol amendments. So if these are going to take several weeks, months to do and be expensive, this just all adds to the cost and the burden to the sponsor. And finally, thinking about things like workflows, again, they can be very different and very complex. And then finally, really putting the patient and the site, especially the patient experience, at the center. If you're going to be collecting PROs or diaries, really going through and thinking about their experience. I mean, I recently worked on a Parkinson study, and they were expecting to do an ePro on a mobile phone. Now that's really difficult if you've got Parkinson's. It's just not the best experience for the patient, and hence not a good outcome. So there's lots of considerations, and the technology really needs to be fit for purpose for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think the technology is a critical foundation these days, but I don't think it's fair for me to say that randomized clinical trials are easy. Observational studies are far more nuanced, but I know there are important nuances. And Mary Glenn, I'm going to let you touch on that in a second. But Dilesh, I wanted to get your perspective. Again, you've been around, not as long as my 150 years, but who should, and we've touched on some of these issues, who should own these studies internally? Is it clinical, commercial, somewhere in between, everybody? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a really great question, and I think Florence, maybe you'd mention. I think it's in the evolution of around who owns these studies. Now, in some companies, there's the real-world evidence departments, right? They serve as subject matter experts. I'm going to answer this question. I think it's a cross-functional own, right? Who should own it in terms of where the budget sits? Let's just operationalize it. It's one thing. Who should own it so that everybody understands why we're doing this study? I think that is the main question from our perspective we need to answer, because otherwise what happens, Jeff, is the terminology I use is it ends up being a kitchen sink approach, right? Every department, every individual at our company would want, oh, why don't we include this? Why don't we include that? Or it'd be interesting to see what happens if, this type of patient population. And then you have what Florence was saying, it's not really patient friendly. And then you have data that just you don't know what to do with it at the end of the study. And there's a lot of data, but you don't know what to do with it. But coming back to your question, I think it should be cross-functional between R&D, medical affairs. We need to get biometrics involved because there are a lot more nuances to this types of study, sometimes after the study is completed than even before. And then even when we go for, most companies have protocol review committees, right, where they review their clinical trial protocols, and we need to have them involved too. Jeff, I don't know how many hours I've spent with different protocol review committees saying that, power calculation is not appropriate for this study. We don't need to do sample size calculations, right? Or we don't need to have a primary endpoint, right? We can have this is an observational study. So I think to the extent there needs to be an owner and somebody with a real world evidence background, but it's really a cross-functional team, because otherwise you just end up with parts of the study that are not either practical to operationalize, or when you have the data, you just don't know what to do with it. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I think it's similar to my experience as well. And a lot of our clients are small biotechs that don't have the luxury of even having the one or two people to coordinate this. That's where, frankly, I think our most successful programs are where there's a collaboration between, for example, us as a CRO and a sponsor that may not have the experience and the resources. I know we're going to come to Q&A.
Jeff, could I just make one point? Sorry to interrupt there. Just you mentioned the CRO and I forgot. And I think it's critically important too, because these days, you talk to any external service provider and they will have capabilities in our RWE. And I think for us, what we have learned is, for myself, is the CRO also kind of functioning as an industry where we think we want to do it, but our capability exists in our RCTs. And the CRO wants to do it, but their capabilities behind the scene also exist in RCTs, right? So really peel that onion when we're evaluating CROs to say, do they truly have this capability? Have they done this before for regulatory purposes, for access purposes, or whatever it is? So I just wanted to make that one point. It's not just easy to choose a CRO. I think we need to do a lot more due diligence when we're choosing a CRO too.
Yes, and onion is the right metaphor, I think, Dilesh. It can be pretty stinky if you don't really peel back those layers. Mary Glenn, again, we're going to go to Q&A in a second here for the audience, but have you seen clients getting clearer on what they want? I mean, periodically, I think the situation Dilesh and Florence described, we're dealing with people that this is kind of new to. Are things getting better?
Well, I think, yes and no, right? There are still challenges. And one of the things I think everyone today has touched on is really the importance of getting clarity up front about why is this study being conducted? What are we hoping to achieve? Are we being mandated? Or are we being proactive, right? What are the key questions that need to be addressed? What are the the respective critical data variables that need to be included? I know that historically we've gone into some of these discussions and you get a lot of people in the room and everybody has a perspective and everybody wants everything, right? But taking a step back strategically and saying, let's talk about really what are the critical data variables that we need to answer for this particular study, taking into consideration, obviously, the patient's involvement, the site involvement, wanting to have a low burden impact to patients and to sites, being clear around who the key stakeholders are for the studies, what's the value to the patients and the sites for their participation. And then along those lines, and I think Delish just alluded to this, is like really getting the quote unquote right people in the room from the start, right? So in many cases, we start out with procurement, who has a very specific responsibility, right? Getting through some of those more standard questions, and then bringing in clinical thought leaders. And that's where I think there's a great opportunity for us to partner with clients who know their product, who know their disease, who know that their issues, who know what they've got some plans around the launch of a product. And then we bring in our teams who have that operational experience. And so as a result of bringing those teams together and really working as partners and sharing information and collaborating, I think is something that's really important. And so, bringing people together in that capacity early on, bringing in the functional leads so that we're very clear around who's doing what. We've certainly worked on studies now, and I alluded to this earlier, where we've got we're working with clients who have very experienced data management team, statisticians who are involved in writing the SAP. But how are we going to be working together, being clear about our roles and responsibilities, I think is very important. And then how we're ultimately going to be using this data to inform some of the, scientific discoveries. So, as I think about clinical trials and some of the real world evidence opportunity, I think that failing to use real world data can result in missing out in a better understanding of things like effectiveness of drugs and opportunity to leverage some of these important data as it relates to scientific and humanistic outcomes and questions. And I was reading something the other day that was talking about this, and the term came up was harmonizing the source data, right? So how can we bring these different sources together to really harmonize them and look at them holistically, versus just one snapshot? If it's an RCT that's very regimented, doesn't reflect standard of care, how can we supplement some of these things to really allow patients to, if it's an RCT, how can we pull from their maybe electronic medical record to incorporate a much fuller picture as we think about the patient's condition and the patient's experience? So linking some of that information to trial data.
I got to stop you here. I think the critical thing you said was at the outset that we've got to make sure we're clear on what are the questions that we want to address with the study, and then operationalize it using all these different dimensions, all these different parameters that we're concerned about. So I think we're going to go quickly if we have any time. Sydney, do we have time for Q&A?
Very quick Q&A, yes.
All right. What's the audience instruction? They're going to type it into the chat box?
Feel free to start off with some of those questions that you've already received from the audience.
Okay, great. Let me look at one of them. Delish or Florence, maybe you guys can talk about the concept of a hybrid model in which the retrospective data kind of jumpstarts a prospective study, and it touches on some of the things Mary Glenn said about keeping the site burden. Can we grab data to pre-populate a case report form, an electronic case report form? Is that what we're seeing more and more of these days? Florence, Delish?
Go ahead, Florence.
I can answer. So it's not just, I think the concept of hybrid is really important, and thinking about that up front in your study design. And it's for many things. One is being able to get data directly from an EMR or an EHR. Two is via the usual way, which is copying across from an EHR into an EDC. And three, again, for example, with e-consent, a lot of patients will be able to do e-consent by themselves, but some of them, like my dad, would still need a piece of paper and be consented in person in front of someone. So these are all different ways that this study needs to accommodate. So when we talk about hybrid, we often think about all these different methods.
Yeah, Jeff, I'll quickly add one thing. In hybrid, in my mind, also comes through as maybe using existing data set as a control group, right? Historical control group, and then makes things a lot more efficient. And allows us to, but we need to again make sure it's fit for purpose. But we've tried to do that where we've used in the past existing data sets as a control group, historical control.
Yeah, no, I think again, sorry we've run out of time here. Clearly, we could be talking for another hour about all the different nuances of this. But there's data, there's evidence, there's bringing it all together in a portfolio fashion. I'll turn it over to you, Sydney. I do want to thank our panelists, Alesh, Florence, Mary Glenn. I know there'll be a contact listing later on if anybody has any other question. It's our favorite topic, so again, thanks everyone for participating. And Sydney, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So that brings us to the end of this webinar, and thank you for sending in those questions. If we could not attend to your questions, the team at Worldwide Clinical Trials may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, you can refer to the email address on your screen. Thank you again, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And now a survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now please join us in thanking our speakers, Jeff Trotter, Mary Glenn Vreeland, Florence Barkatz, and Dilesh Doshi. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.